However, this is a class on Genesis, and if everybody got a handout, you don't have to have one if you can see one. Really what this is just kind of some notes that I put together, and we went through the side where it says this one will give us rest. That's more or less the first side. We were talking about Noah last week, and at the top you'll see some of the things I mentioned. One thing I did not mention, however, regarding Noah, do you remember his dad's name? Lamech. Now, was there a previous Lamech? There was a previous Lamech. He was back in the days of Cain, and he's the one who said, a young man's hurt me, and if somebody hurts me, I'm going to kill him, and I'm going to avenge. If Cain's avenged sevenfold, I'm going to avenge myself 7 times sevenfold. So that's a different Lamech. Time goes on, Lamech is born, and Lamech has Noah. And remember what he says of Noah? It's at the top of the page. This one will give us rest. When Lamech was born, guess who else was still alive based on the chronology in Genesis? Adam was still around. I don't know if you've ever thought through this or done the math, but Adam lived 56 years into Lamech's life. And then Lamech had Adam. And by the time, of course, Lamech had Noah, what did I just say? Oh, sorry. I've told you that story, haven't I, about the guy that was preaching and people were laughing when he was talking about Adam and Eve, and his wife later told him, you weren't saying Adam and Eve, you were saying Tarzan and Jane. So that's kind of how it is, talking about through some of these names. Lamech was 56 years old when Adam died, and so who knows if Adam hadn't passed on to all those successive generations, why the earth was cursed and all of that knowledge had to come down, I would think. This is a speculation, supposition on my part. So perhaps it was on Lamech's mind or his heart. Now that Adam is dead, here's another generation in my son Noah. Noah will give us rest. And of course, he made obvious reference in 529 to, not 529, but to, 529, to the cursing of the ground. So I'm just trying to bring all this together. As I'm studying this, I'm seeing things I never saw before. I know none of you all ever do that when you study the Bible because you already know all the stuff that's in there. But when I study, I see stuff I never saw before, and how could I not have seen this in the previous years of study? Well, I think that's part of the genius of God. No matter how much you think you know, he's put stuff in there that you're not going to find until later. And it's almost like the word is alive. I don't know if you've ever heard that idea, but it's almost like it is. So I just thought that was really fascinating. Yeah. Right. Came through the Moses. Okay, yeah.
Presence of God in the attack. I think when it's just, and then it makes you think about drawing near to God and the impact.
Right. The people who were close to the Lord, Adam, beginning with him. But when you start thinking about it, that's what we call the patriarchal age, meaning God communicated with the patriarchs. How many patriarchs do we have record of God actually communicating with? There's Adam. Who else did God communicate with? He communicated with Cain. He gave him his curse. After Cain, who's next? Now, what does it say of a fellow named Enoch? Enoch walked with God, so the Lord took him. It doesn't say anything about them communicating, but at that time we know God was doing that with some folks, so it may well be that he communicated with Enoch. After Enoch, there's nobody left in line that I can find until we get to Noah. And Noah has conversations with God. God gives him instructions somehow, some way. This is a man with whom God is speaking intimately. And that's one of the points I I saw in the text and I wanted to bring out. Just by way of review from last week, where else in the Bible is Noah mentioned? Tell me some other places or people who mention Noah. The Hebrew writer mentions Noah, all right. There's one. Who? Peter mentions Noah. There's two. Who else? Jesus mentions Noah. Anybody else? How about anybody from the Old Testament? Ezekiel. Ezekiel mentioned Noah, and he held him up as a standard. Actually, God held him up through Ezekiel as a standard of righteousness. Ezekiel said, even if Noah, and what other two guys? Job and Daniel. Even if, pardon me, even if those three guys were here, they could only save themselves. They couldn't save anybody else. It's interesting because that's what we read in Noah's life. He's saving himself because others won't respond to his preaching of the gospel. All right, he's also mentioned in Isaiah and Chronicles. So all of these passages are authenticating the existence of Noah and corroborating his story. Okay, anybody got anything before we move on? We're down at the bottom of that first page about Noah, where it's those little arrows, those little arrow points. God spoke to Noah, chapter 6 and verse 13. And I try to, as I read things as they're presented, I try to imagine the circumstances. If God speaks to Noah in chapter 6 and verse 13, and we read what he says, it's almost an implication that this isn't the first time God has spoken to Noah. That's speculation, that's supposition. But imagine you're Noah, and out of the blue, God says to you, the end of all flesh is at hand. I wonder if there were conversations before that. I don't know. But this isn't the last one they have. God gives him detailed instructions about how to build the ark, gives him work to do. Does God ever talk to anybody in the scriptures without giving them work to do or something to accomplish? Is there a lesson there for us? If I am a Christian, what's my job? I guess I should say, since I'm a Christian. To do what? To spread the word. Yeah. What was Jesus' commission? Go preach the gospel. All you who are qualified. Go preach the gospel. All you who know the Bible well enough. Right. Yes. That's what God was doing with Job when he was asking him all those questions, as Preston's brought up, trying to get Job's mind squared away. Well, Noah's mind has already seemed to be squared away. He's all these things in the mind of God. He's righteous. He's blameless. He walked with God. He's a preacher of righteousness, Peter says. And I also find it interesting that Moses doesn't record that in Genesis. That's something the Holy Spirit saved until Peter's day, when Peter would write that Noah was a preacher of righteousness. So we know those things about him, and he was faithful to the Lord, and he had a relationship with God, and they spoke, and God gave him work to do. And God also made a covenant with Noah in chapter 6 and verse 18. God doesn't make covenants with everybody, but he made a covenant with Noah. And this is one of two covenants that he will make with Noah, although the second one is going to be with Noah and all the earth, even with us. Comes on down through time. Now, the 120 years we talked about briefly last week, I'm not exactly sure how that works out, because God says it's going to be 120 years. I really think, this is my opinion, that God is saying from 120 years from this point, I'm going to bring this flood. Now, Noah was 600 when the flood came. You remember that? On the day of the flood, Noah was 600 years old. How old was he when he had his boys? He was 500. So that must have stuck with you when you thought about that, because if God tells Noah at that 120-year point he's going to bring a flood, he needs to build an ark, Noah was still 20 years away from having boys. I don't know what the what the circumstances were, and I'm not even sure that 120 years is supposed to be understood as that. But here's what I do understand about that 120 years. God didn't just wipe people out. He didn't just have an angry fit and flood the world immediately at that point and start all over. He waited. He waited. Peter mentions this. God waited in the days of Noah while the ark was preparing. God's patience. He's wanting everyone to repent. He takes no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but he wants everybody to repent. And that's what we see in the story of Noah. So when you think about that 120 years, don't get bogged down in the details like I often do, trying to figure out at what point this and at what point that. 120 years means God's giving people time, giving people space to repent. Any questions on that? Any observations? Anything I've missed that you'd like to point out? Of course, I never miss anything, right? Boy, there's a statement. The world had a new beginning through Noah in chapter 8, verses 20 and 22. Think about it. You get off the ark with your family, and you are it. You are it. There are no other people. There are no other families. There's no place to go to visit your neighbor. There's no Dollar General, believe it or not. They're building one on every corner now, but there's nothing like that in Noah's day. He gets off the ark, and they are it. God tells Noah and his family to be fruitful and multiply in chapter 9, verses 1 and 7. When was the last time God said that? Adam and Eve in the garden. Be fruitful and multiply. So he never told anybody, hey, don't have any kids. Yeah, the world's a bad place. It's going to be rough. It's going to be hard. He didn't tell Noah, you know what? It's just the 8 of you. It's going to be hard. You better not have any children. He said, you be fruitful and multiply. And so children were born to them. And this question will probably come up. These cousins, because all the kids of Ham, Shem, and Japheth would have been cousins to one another, what'd they do? They married one another. Now, if you take a look at genetics, if you know anything about genetics or you want to learn something about genetics, back then, when the gene pool was cleaner, you wouldn't have had the same problems we have today. But as time goes on, all of the problems that we have genetically are compounded when you marry somebody who's close to you genetically because of the downline mess that you have. It's like, I don't know if it's exactly like this, but when you take a paper and you run it through a copy machine, and then you take that copy and you run that through another copy machine, is the third copy going to be as good as the first one? Probably not, but you may not be able to tell it at that point with the eyeball. But you take that third copy and you run that through 15, you do that successively, then you're going to start to say, oh, wait a minute, this isn't very clear. What happened here? Well, that's the copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And what else is involved? Sin is involved. Never underestimate the negative impact of sin. What does Paul say about sin in Romans chapter 8? We looked at this a couple of weeks ago. What does the whole creation do, according to Paul in Romans 8? It groans. The entire creation groans in travail. When I read that or think about that, I also think about Leviticus 18. Well, go to Leviticus 18. I don't remember if I brought this up with regard to Romans 8, but Paul in Romans 8 personified the earth. I think it might have been more literal than I understand. But in Leviticus 18, this is where God tells the Israelites, don't do all these sexual sins, because this is what the Canaanites have done. And here's what happened to the Canaanites, verse 24. Do not defile yourselves by any of these things, for by all these things the nations which I'm casting out before you have become defiled. Is that just morally, or is there more to it than the moral defilement? For the land has become defiled, therefore I have brought its punishment upon it, so the land has spewed out its inhabitants. What does that mean? I don't know, but it's not good. And what Moses is doing, or what the Spirit is doing through Moses as he writes out Leviticus, is giving us this idea that the physical land, this part of the world spewed out its inhabitants because of their immorality, their immoral practices. And that's what God is telling us here, and he'll say that again in verse 28, this idea of the defilement causing the land to spew out its inhabitants. So those cousins, the children of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, would have married one another, possibly even married sisters and brothers, and everything would have been okay back then, and that's how the world was repopulated. They were told to be fruitful and multiply. When was the command to be fruitful and multiply rescinded? No, that was in chapter 6 when he was talking about destroying the earth, the idea of not struggling with man. What's that? I don't know exactly when that happened, but David writes about that the days of man. And I'm not saying that God limited the days of man, but just that the circumstances limited the days of man. If the earth has changed, like it probably has, and we're getting more UV rays from the sun than they would have in the days of Noah prior to the flood, if the atmosphere's changed and there's not as much oxygen as there would have been prior to the flood, so many things could have changed at the flood that we are not specifically told about that would have made it more likely that people would have lived less. Also, here's another idea that somebody has thrown into the mix. What did Adam and Eve have access to while they were in the garden? The tree of knowledge, yes, that they weren't supposed to eat of, but what did they have access to that was fine for them to eat from? The tree of life. Could it possibly be that the power in that tree of life stayed with their seed down line several generations and then finally was used up after the flood? Because it's after the flood that we start to see people's lives being shortened by a great deal. A lot of things to consider, a lot of possibilities, but the bottom line is always the same. Faith. Faith, regardless of what we believe about the years of life, why they were shortened, faith is what all these folks are held up in Scripture as having had. Questions, comments, observations? All right.
Are you sure? I mean, we don't know for sure whether they ate it. We don't know that.
Adam and Eve? I think they did. It wasn't one of the trees that God said you're not allowed to eat from.
But then there was a passage in Genesis 3:2 where God, they were talking about lest they eat of the tree of life and live forever.
Right. Because if they would have continued to have access to it, this is my understanding, if they would have continued to have access to it, they would never have died. But now, because he told them, in the day you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, what's going to happen? You're going to die. And so death, the process of death began, and that may have been a big part of that process, was God cutting off their access to the tree of life. Of course, it wasn't just physical death. Sin brings about a spiritual death, a separation from God. There's so much to consider. And think about it again, I know we've talked about this. If God took the time to explain to Marty all the reasons for all the questions I have that I want answers for, Marty wouldn't want to read the Bible because it'd just be so big. And he'd get bogged down in all the details when it's like God is saying, here's all you need right now. I'm trying to get you to the point where I bring my son in and save you through my son. Oh, wow, well, let's keep going then. You ever watch a movie or read a book and it's just kind of moving real slow? It's like, oh, man. And by the time you get to the good part, you're asleep. And you're saying, that's the way it is in our Bible class. Anyway, where are we here? Animals now become food. Chapter 9, verses 2 to 4. People didn't eat animals before this. There were clean animals and unclean animals, but what might that have been with reference to? Why would you have clean animals as opposed to unclean animals? Sacrifice. That's the reason. It doesn't say that, but that's why I think there were animals designated as clean, because that's what God did in the law later on. He would say, here are the animals you sacrifice. But animals would now become food. Look at chapter 9, verse 2. The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every beast of the earth and on every bird of the sky with everything that creeps on the ground. And all the fish of the sea, into your hand they are given. I was sitting in a ground blind yesterday, and I was camoed. The only thing you could see were my eyeballs. And I squinted them down because a little doe came really close. And she was just picking her way through there, and she looked over and saw me, and it was like, I don't know what she saw. I thought I had concealed myself so well that nothing could pick me out. And I don't know what she saw because my eyes were squinted way down. That's your eyes are a dead giveaway, but I guess a live giveaway. But her ears perked up, and I sat so still, I guess she thought, okay, maybe that's not a man. And she went back to whatever she was doing. And then I killed her and ate her. Anyway, no, it's just... But when that happens, I'm reminded of this right here. Animals didn't used to be afraid of people, apparently. It used to be the Garden of Eden. Could you imagine going outside and petting a deer or caressing a turkey? Or, yeah, just he won't spur you now. They'll spur you now, but they wouldn't have then because that was a different day. And now God says the fear of you and the dread of you is going to be on every beast of the field. And he's giving them into your hand, it says in verse 2, so you can eat them. Every moving thing that's alive shall be food for you. I give all to you as I gave the green plant. So before, they were all vegetarians. That's all they ate. That's all they needed. By the way, I have a theory that the food was a whole lot better before the flood, too. Probably that was another thing affected. If you eat a good apple or a good watermelon now, just wonder what might that have been like before the flood. Oh, man. Anyway, because God makes everything perfect. That's the way it was in the garden. That's the way it was prior to the sin. The only restriction is what? Blood. Don't eat the blood. Don't eat the blood. You kill something, you pour out that blood. Now, what animals are free for Noah and his family to eat? All of them. Eat them all. So today, when I go into a foreign culture and they're having bat for lunch, which people do, they wrap them up in their own wings and roast them. There's all kinds of crazy things that people eat. And then people come here and you eat chickens? And really, you think about it. Have you ever watched a chicken? And pigs? Now, feral hogs out in the bush, that's one thing. They're clean. But domestic pigs, have you ever been to a pig farm? You don't have to go to a pig farm. Just get downwind to one. And we eat that stuff like it's going out of style. Just go to Billy Sims later after church. Oh, now I've distracted you and you're thinking about Billy Sims. But we eat everything, and it's okay. It wouldn't be until the law that God would put restrictions on the Jews, only the Jews, for what they should eat. Excuse me. Capital punishment begins, chapter 9, verses 5 and 6. Surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I'll require it, and from every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. Who's hearing this? Who's there to hear it? Just Noah and his family. They are the only people, and God is saying, all right, any of your boys or any of your wives kill somebody else, I expect you to kill them. That's what God's telling them. Yeah. Right. Right.
Here we are, and we're getting a fresh start. We got to survive. And he's telling them what not to do. Can you imagine the fear of what they had just seen happen versus the impact of what he's saying?
Right. Now, what was mentioned twice in Genesis 6 with regard to God's reason for bringing the flood. Twice in Genesis 6. You can go back and take a look. That's not cheating. That's extra credit in this class. Violence. Violence. The thing that sticks on our mind is when God said, every imagination of the thought of man is continually evil. That sticks in my mind. But then I noticed later he mentioned violence twice. Apparently there was a lot of killing going on. Where do we first hear about that killing? Well, it goes just prior to this back to Lamech. What did Lamech say? I'm going to avenge myself 7 times what Cain was avenged, and Cain had already avenged himself. He thought, apparently in his mind, he's avenging himself of the emotional stress that his brother put on him. How did Abel do that? He did the right thing. If you do the right thing in life, you're going to put stress on some people. That's just the way it works. And so they will call you things, and they will accuse you of things, and they will not like you. If you do the right thing, that's the way your life is going to be. Why did they crucify Jesus? Did anybody do more right things than Jesus? Really, can you imagine that? Having somebody in your community who could heal everybody who was sick, who could raise the dead. Not just that, you could go to him with any problem you have, and he would say, here's the wisdom of God regarding your trouble, your situation. Here's what you need to do. Here's the action you need to take. And it would be the most perfect thing you could ever hear. What are you going to do with that guy? Well, let's kill him. And so Jesus said, if they called the master of the house Beelzebub, Lord of the demons, what are they going to call you? Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed. And so God tells Adam and Eve, God, I got to get the story straight, Marty. Noah and his family, if there's a murder that takes place among your family, here's what you need to do. You need to kill the murderer. We're going to do like Barney Fife said, although Barney Fife wouldn't be for a few thousand years. But what did Barney Fife say? Nip it, where? In the bud. Nip it in the bud. That's what God, I believe, was trying to do with Noah and his family. Now, here's the deal. He could have just told them that and left it. But what did he also do? Right. And he told them that, but he could have told them that and left it. But what did he do? He had it written in a book so we could read it. Because I imagine, what other things might God have told Noah and his family now that they've come off the ark? Would he have said, hey, there's a place over here where this kind of seed has sprouted and you can find food over here, or there's a place over there where the fish tend to congregate because there's been this turmoil in the water. Who knows what God might have told them to make their lives better and easier, but this is what he records us, or leaves recorded for us to read that he told them. If anybody commits a murder, kill the murderer. When is this law rescinded? He never rescinded the be fruitful and multiply command. He's never rescinded the command to put to death those who commit murder. None of that's ever been taken away. Now we can argue, well, that was thousands of years ago, Marty. Yeah, it was. But I think what God is giving us here are some principles by which to live. One tends to life. Be fruitful and multiply. What does the other tend to? That's a trick question. It also tends to life. Has murder escalated in different cultures around the globe? What would have happened if the first people to commit murder would have been put to death? If the community would have got together and said, this guy killed that guy, what are we going to do? Well, let's hang him. Let's shoot him. Let's cut their heads off. Oh, how many more murders do you think would have successively taken place? I think that might have at least stopped those guys from killing anybody. I don't like death. God does not like death. But he just killed thousands of people, perhaps millions of people in a flood because of violence. And so now he's telling Noah, this is my estimation. I don't want this to happen again, so here's how I want you to stop it. If people start killing others, you kill them. You kill the murderers. You put that to bed. You nip it in the bud. All right. Second covenant, chapter 9, verses 8 to 17. Who wants to read that? Anybody feel like reading? Come on, nobody tired of hearing my voice? Okay, I'll read it. Genesis 9, 8 to 17. Then God spoke to Noah and his sons with him, saying, Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, with every creature, every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth. I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, This is the sign of the covenant which I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all successive generations. Guess what we are? We are a successive generation. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. It shall come about when I bring a cloud over the earth that the bow will be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the cloud, then I will look upon it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. Every time you see a rainbow, does everybody know how to see a rainbow if it's raining? If the sun is out and it's raining, turn so that the sun is behind you and look ahead. And that's the way to see a rainbow if there's one out there. And Oklahoma is a great place to see rainbows. I remember driving across Wyoming. I saw 3 rainbows, boom, 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 together. In Hawaii, I saw one of those round ones. I thought that was the weirdest thing in the world, but I've seen pictures of them since. God puts his bow in the cloud, and however many he puts, and whatever shape they are, it's pretty cool. And today, what's happened with the rainbow? Isn't that just like men, though? You take the very symbol that God gives Noah and his family and the entire earth to show, I'm not going to destroy people for being immoral, and then you take that sign, that emblem, and you use that as the flag to lead the way for your immorality. It's crazy. If I were living that lifestyle and standing under that flag, I would be so scared. Understanding what God has said about all immorality, not just that immorality, but all immorality, and then understanding specifically what he will do when we get to chapter 19 in Sodom and Gomorrah. That's absolutely true. And that's what Peter and Jude will both say later on, that if you're living that lifestyle, you've already put fear of authority away from you. You don't have any respect for authority. You're going to do things your own way. You're going to live according to your own will. And Peter will address that just as he addressed Noah, because so many things in his day were parallels. And they're pretty much consistent parallels down through time. All right. Any questions or anything about Noah? We're about to leave Noah and start looking at Father Abraham.
I think in verse 15.
Yes, of which chapter?
What we're just reading.
Okay, chapter 9.
It's the first time that I have noticed that he talks about his covenant being between the animals.
Mm-hmm.
I just never had noticed that. Like you say, sometimes things stick out that I don't know why he would have made it with the animals, but never had noticed that.
Well, I don't think the animals would be conscious of any of that. That's not the point, I don't think. To me, it's something that he's making Noah and his family aware of, and by keeping it in the writing, making us aware of, that everything he's created is going to last. He's not going to destroy any of it. He's not going to save man and punish the animals as part of the fallen earth. He's going to preserve everything from flood. But what's going to happen next? He doesn't mention it here. What will be the next step? The next time God comes in judgment, it'll be fire. What's that song the kids used to sing? I keep wanting to sing, God said to Noah, there's going to be a floody, but there's one, it won't be water, but fire next time. That's one of the lines from it. But that's a song. It's not going to be water next time, but it's going to be fire, and that's what we're coming. Really? Mm-hmm. I don't know more specifically an answer to your question. Excuse me. But, kid, I think you bring up a good point that was with the animals as well as the people. When we look in the sediments left after the flood, what do we find so much of, though, but animals, animal remains, fossils? When you go to the museum and you see a fossil of an animal or a dinosaur on display, I believe that that's almost certainly the remains of something that died in the flood, because the earth is covered over with about 2 miles worth of waterborne sediment. What kind of catastrophe would have to take place to cover the earth with 2 miles worth of waterborne sediment? And when you go out to Arizona and you see those lines in the Grand Canyon, what do those lines tell you? What do they almost certainly represent? But each one of those perfectly straight lines represents another wave of sediment that God brought in with the flood. Water would come and go and come and go, and every time you see that line of strata or sediment changing, it's perfectly flat because it all happened at the same time. If you would have left that layer of sediment there for a couple of hundred years even, it wouldn't be flat. Grasses would grow in it and break it up, trees would grow, animals would burrow into it, and all those lines of sediment would not be perfectly flat. They're only perfectly flat because they were made at the same time, and then that canyon was cut out in a short amount of time to expose those perfectly flat layers. But then you go above the canyon, and this is what really boggles my mind, and you look at the rock formations above the level of the Grand Canyon, and they have the same kinds of layers of strata in them. So the canyon wasn't the level of the flood. The level of the flood went up higher than the Grand Canyon. And everywhere you go in the world, you see that kind of stratification. And in so many places in the world, when you go up high, and you dig through those strata, you find animal life. But what kind of animal life do you usually find even on the mountains? You find marine life. You find mollusks, crustaceans, nautilus shells. You find all kinds of things that would have lived in the oceans. And why is that up so high if this flood story isn't true?
When we went to Kentucky, we stopped on the side of the road.
Oh, yeah.
I still have that fossil that's the same as some of the coral I brought back from Cozumel when we were diving.
Wow.
Exactly the same.
I remember that trip. We were driving through the hills of Kentucky, and when you go back east, and there's a lot of cut-throughs, and you can do this down in the southeastern part of Oklahoma too, where they cut through a hill to make a road. You just look as you're going by, and there are the stratified layers. And in this particular place we were driving through in Kentucky, there were marine fossils. And you're telling us that when you go diving, you found the same stuff.
Same fossil. This is just white. This one's fossilized in the rock after the boat.
So you've got the one that was living and the one that was fossilized. Interesting, fascinating. Well, that's what we should expect. Do you know that they found dinosaur bones that still have soft tissue inside them? Do a little research if you're interested in that. Google soft tissue in dinosaur bones or T-Rex bones with soft tissue. This was back in 95. They knew this back in 95. Somebody broke open a T-Rex bone, and there was soft tissue, so soft that they could stretch it and make it transparent. So you stretch it and you could see through it. Now, where is the science that shows us how 65 million year old bones could have still soft tissue inside of them? Because they can't. There is no science for that. So there's just all kinds of evidence that the flood happened, and what we're seeing today throughout the world is evidence of the flood. I know I've mentioned to you, but I'll mention it again because we won't get into Adam in this late time in class. What's coal? No, not cold. Coal, C-O-A-L. Coal. Coal is the remains of organic material that's been compressed and heated, and it's heated by compression. That's what coal is. Organic material, meaning plants, animals, and there's coal all over the world, in thick beds all over the world. What's oil? It's the same thing. Oil is the organic remains of organic material. It's not naturally occurring. It's something that's in the ground because God buried over tons and tons and tons of living things, and they became oil. Natural gas, what's natural gas? That's the byproduct of decomposition of organic material. So that's all over the, anyway, just a few notes as we leave, and that's, right. Thank you. Bring these handouts back next week, and we'll use them when we talk about Abram.